Welcome to Blue Compass, Let's Talk About It, where our experts are discussing the hottest topics in the digital marketing world. And today, we're going to be discussing Google Analytics 4. And at the end, we'll tell you our recommendation on whether you should switch or not. First question today, is Google Analytics 4 an update of Google's Universal Analytics?
Google Analytics 4 is actually a replacement for Analytics when compared to Universal Analytics. It is not an upgrade, it is not an enhancement, it's a completely different way of collecting data. So when we look at Google Analytics 4, it's focused more on the user and how they're interacting with the website, what are they doing. It tracks them across devices. If you have an app or if you have multiple subdomains and different web entities, you're actually able to track a person more holistically across all of your digital properties, where Universal Analytics is focused more on the individual pages that a user is interacting with. For this reason, it's not easy to compare apples to apples between Google Analytics 4 and Universal Analytics. When we look at this, we're looking at different metrics, we're looking at updates to how we're tracking, and as we start to look at what does this mean for KPIs, strategies, and different analytics tactics that you have in place, it's going to be a completely different way for us to start analyzing how somebody is interacting with our website when they come to our digital properties.
So if this isn't just a simple update from the current version of Analytics, what are the biggest differences between Universal Analytics and the new Google Analytics 4?
So Google Analytics 4, like Katrina said, is actually a large shift philosophically for this platform. And one of the main ways that they've differentiated is with the actual metric terminology. So we talk a lot about behavior metrics with Google Analytics, including bounce rate, average time on page, and average pages per session. Well, those metrics aren't exactly what Google Analytics 4 is looking for you to measure against anymore. The primary focus for Google Analytics 4 is things like engagement rate, average engagement time per session, and views per user. As you can see with these are more packaged as things like engagement and focusing on the user themselves. Whereas before, the metrics were more based on pages and page URLs and page titles, things like that. So while we're focusing more on the user experience than ever, Google Analytics 4 plays a lot into that. So lining these behavior metrics up, the example of Universal Analytics metric would be bounce rate. The comparable metric within Google Analytics 4 is engagement rate. The primary difference is they're basically metrics flipped on themselves. Bounce rate measured the number of people that came to a page and then left immediately of your total sessions, whereas in Google Analytics 4 with engagement rate, it's how many users either engaged in an event or stayed on the page for at least 10 seconds. So again, more focus on what users are taking action as opposed to what users are inactive on a page.
I find that 10 seconds really interesting because with Universal Analytics, we didn't have a way to say like somebody stayed on the page for a long time. And so if somebody read a blog but didn't interact at all and they left, that could still be a bounce. But with this metric, 10 seconds is a really short amount of time for them to make that transition with.
I'll be interested to see definitely if down the line we get some setting options with that. If we can choose, is that 10 seconds, is that 30 seconds? But it does pose some nice kind of information as far as before we were dealing with average time on page and average session duration. And they were similar metrics, but Google couldn't put that information together. They didn't know how long you spent on a page if you didn't go to a second page. So now that we have this engagement rate, we're getting a little bit more of that information all in one metric.
One of the things we're working on a lot here is how do we make this work for us? Because it's still in beta. We're still seeing changes like every month to it. The user interface isn't necessarily what it needs to be yet. We're seeing a lot of gaps here, and it's going to be fascinating to see how they make this a usable, comprehensive tool.
And because those base metrics that we rely on so much in all of our reporting are changing, the base reports are changing with it. So it's going to be a very fundamental shift in how we pull data. It's going to take some time to figure out what is the right way to lay things out. How are we getting the same information that we needed in a completely new format?
And in classic Google format, They're not telling us exactly what's going to replace that. We know as part of the algorithm currently, universal analytics metrics that matter are the ones Jay just went over, and those behavior metrics, but we don't know what are the new benchmarks going to be? What do we need to rely on to get to a good user experience according to Google from a GA perspective? So lots of learning all around for everybody in the digital field right now.
It's been said that the new Google Analytics 4, like the purpose of it isn't necessarily for reporting, it's more for analysis. Would you agree with that, and what would you say to that?
Lisa.
That's a good question. I don't think there is, the two go hand in hand. I mean, you have to report to your clients, you have to do that internally to understand what's happening. So I think that that's probably true. It's getting you to the insight, it's getting you to the outcome quicker, but it doesn't take away the fact that we need to give something to our clients, we need to have something to show.
One of the things we're seeing as trends from Google, and trends is a loose term here, GTM came out obviously a while ago at this point, but one of the statements Google made was Google Tag Manager is supposed to replace the need for a developer. And I put extreme quotes on that because our developers would slap me if we just said that outright. And that's so not true. We rely on our developers extremely heavily in Google Tag Manager. But they're saying a similar tune for Google Analytics 4 of you shouldn't need to be a data expert to use it. It should be easier to find what you're looking for. And those insights that Lisa was saying, I'm not sold on it yet. We have a steep learning curve with this, so we're going to see how that plays out. But if they're able to deliver what they're promising, it should be easier for somebody without a ton of background in Google Analytics or without a ton of digital analytics information to be able to find some answers to questions when they get in there.
To the point of that as well, they're definitely moving more in a direction of calculated metrics as opposed to volume metrics. So whereas page views was something that we looked at, or sessions as a primary metric, Google Analytics 4 is really trying to push you into what are the other metrics that actually matter, like daily returning users or daily active users, and things like engagement rate, metrics that tell more about how valuable you are to your users as opposed to how many of them you're getting.
So, does Blue Compass recommend making the switch?
That's a really good question. What we are recommending right now is to go ahead and get Google Analytics 4 set up and start collecting that historical data, even if you're not to the point, and we don't recommend being to the point of reporting out on that data, because things still are in beta, things are changing all the time. We're not really ready to set benchmarks in there, base all of our insights on that data, but collecting it is going to help down the road. It's going to help so that while we have that issue with historical data comparison in Universal Analytics, you're collecting data in GA4 and you have that historical comparison. And it's also going to help when we get to that point of being ready to report, there isn't such a big learning curve immediately. We have time to dip our toes in to understand the reports before we really need to use them and gain insights from them.
So to be clear, does that mean that you're suggesting that people should be running both Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4 at the same time?
Yes, that's what we're doing right now, having them both collect data so that we can work out of either platform. There's a few ways to implement this based on how you have Universal Analytics implemented right now. So if you have the Universal Analytics G tag hard-coded on your website, then you should be able to upgrade to GA4 with no new tags. Google Analytics will prompt you to just say, hey, upgrade this now. If you have Google Analytics implemented through Google Tag Manager, then this does require a new tag through Google Tag Manager as well. It's really easy to set up, just basically adding in your new analytics ID, and then you'll have those both running concurrently. So this allows us to collect that data in both platforms while we're getting used to GA4, but continuing to mainly focus in Universal.
Okay.
And while you're talking about the data collection, one of the key things that we hit on earlier was data retention, and the default for Google Analytics 4 is only have 2 months worth of data at a time. So you actually have to go into your Google Analytics 4 property settings, go to data retention, and update that to 14 months so that you can start keeping that long-term data that we talked about earlier.
And that's a great point too. If you are getting beyond that 14 months, if you've already switched over quite a while ago, make sure you're keeping an eye on this and exporting historical data from GA4 that you may want to keep and retain.
Okay. Well, there you have it. set it up, run them both at the same time, get that data, change the settings to 14 months, and you'll be set to go. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.